Everybody, happy Wednesday. Hope you guys are doing well. And where did my meters go? Let's see. There they are. There's the meters. I can see what I'm hearing. I can hear what I'm seeing, or something like that. Whatever. So, yeah, hope everybody's having a good week so far. It's early in the week, so I know early. Is it early in the week? No, it's midweek. Good Lord. I don't know what to say. I'm just standing in front of the microphone. All right. Let's get on to this. We are talking about modulation effects this week. It is week 18, which is crazy for me, but it is week 18 of our Effects on Violin series. We are getting near the end of this. And then I've got a bunch of other projects that I want to do here, Electric Violin Shop. So lots of cool things coming your way, I assure you. Very cool to me. Anyway. So in this series, of this Effects on Violin series, we're hitting a different effect each week. And we will talk about what that effect is, what are the parameters, how do you get it, is it in stomp boxes, what's the whole deal, how can you use it on strings. And then most of the weeks we will have a guest artist who will talk about how they use that effect when they're making their art. And this week we've got the amazing Tracy Silverman, who is a good friend and a amazing player, fantastic player, and he's also an incredible teacher. Just the way his brain works is really conducive to teaching things, and so he's going to be teaching about modulation effects. So, what are modulation effects? Well, these guys are modulation effects. It is not an exhaustive list, but it's a lot of them. And what are they? What do all these things do? Well, the way they work is that they take your dry signal and they make a copy of it. And then the unaffected signal just goes on by, and then the copy of it gets manipulated, and then it gets added back in with your original signal and then out to the world. And it looks like we're building a house or something here. As an example, here is how flanging works. For those of you under 50, we used to record music on tape. Crazy stuff. And this is a tape player that you're looking at. So your source would be at the bottom, and then they split that signal, and you can see the untouched one comes through, and on that side over there, there's somebody putting their hand on the flange of the tape deck and kind of messing with the way that it's coming through. That's why it's called a flanger. And then those two signals are recombined, and they go out to the world. What's happening with a flanger is that the copy of your dry signal is slightly delayed, and that also changes the pitch on it because tape, and then it adds it back to your signal. This is labeled here to look like a phaser, where signal A is in one phase and signal B is in another phase, and that's possible. That's actually called a phaser. If we're using time instead of phase and degrees, then that's what a flanger would look like. So you've got your regular signal coming through and then slightly delayed, and when you add all those together, you get kind of a pulsating mix of things going on. You get some comb filtering and a lot of interesting stuff. Remember wah pedals when we were talking about wah pedals? Wah pedal is a sweepable bandpass EQ filter with the center frequency controlled by your foot. What does that mean? It means that there's a band of frequencies that is allowed to pass where everything else is cut, and which frequency is at the center of that band is a controllable thing, and you can control with your foot. When you put your heel down, low frequencies pass. When you put your toe down, high frequencies pass, right? What's that got to do with anything? Well, imagine if we had a little robot or a machine that could turn the knob that controls that center frequency instead of a foot pedal. What's up, Jesse? Hope you're doing well, man. I see you're playing all over the place. That's awesome. What if there's a little robot that could control that knob? And what if we could tell that robot how fast to move that knob and then how far? So do we move it, pretty fast in a little tight area? Do we move it slow in a wide area or whatever? That little robot could give us a very controllable sound. Well, that robot is called a low frequency oscillator, or an LFO. In music, we talk about frequency all the time. We're talking about the frequency of the notes that we're hearing. Like an open A on a violin is 440 hertz, or 440 cycles per second. A low frequency oscillator might move at 1 cycle per second, or a half of a cycles per second, or 3 cycles per second. So that's low frequency, means below what we can hear. And then it's oscillating. It's going back and forth and moving. So we could tell it how fast, how far, and then what shape to cycle in. So imagine that the little robot's turning from 0 to 10, kind of slow, and then jerks it back to 0. And then kind of slow up to 10, and then jerks it back to 0. That would be a sawtooth wave. If the robot's just kind of constant speed, 0 to 10, back to 0, back to 10, back to 0, that would be a triangle wave. You kind of understand how that works. So the shape of the wave, how fast and how far, those are things that we can control with an LFO. What's that got to do with anything? Back to this flanger. So we've got your signal that's coming through, and then we've got a copy of your signal, and we are time delaying that copy. But what if we attach an LFO and we can change how much that time delay is delaying, and it's just kind of cycling back and forth in this area, and we can control how much it's delaying, we can control how fast it's delaying, but it's always delaying, and then that thing is always moving. When it's combined back with your signal again, or your dry signal again, then you get kind of this swimmy thing that provides, it's a dynamic effect. Not dynamics like piano and forte, but dynamic like changing with respect to time. So with modulation effects, we copy your signal, we manipulate the copy, we cycle that manipulation with an LFO, and then you have a modulation effect. So these different effects, this is what we are manipulating with on the copy of your signal. So the copy of your signal on a tremolo effect, we are manipulating the volume. So take your dry signal, split it out. This one goes through unaffected. This one we attach to an LFO, and it just turns the volume of your signal up and down, and then it recombines them. And that's how you get sort of that pulsating sound of a tremolo. With vibrato, it's with pitch. We change the pitch. Now, we can do that with our left hand as we're playing, but there are certain times that we can't do that, or we want the machine to do it for us for some reason. With flanger and chorus, it is time and pitch that are offset. With a phaser, it is the phase of the signal that is offset, and with Leslie, it's pitch. Now, you're like, well, some of these are the same. Flange and chorus, if those are both time and pitch, why are they two different things? Well, from a 30,000-foot view, we'll describe it the same way. The implementation is a little different, and they do sound a little different. When we get to the interview with Tracy, he is going to give a lot of examples of how these effects sound. So you'll understand once you hear him describe this. And it's the same with Leslie and vibrato. Leslie is the rotating speaker effect. So if you see a Hammond B3 or something, they're playing that, and there's a big wooden box sitting next to them. It looks like it weighs 400 pounds because it weighs 400 pounds. And there's a speaker in there spinning on a turntable, and it's using the Doppler effect, like when you hear an ambulance go by and it's wee, woo, wee, woo, 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 woo. That's the Doppler effect. Well, that's what happens with that spinning speaker. You can hear that the time and the pitch of that speaker is changing with respect to you as you're standing still. What are the parameters on these modulation effects? Well, it's all the stuff with the LFO. So how fast it's cycling, how much it moves, what the shape of that LFO is, and then how much of this manipulated signal is recombined with your dry signal. And it's all the way from none of this manipulated signal to we've pulled out all of your dry signal, and it's only the manipulated signal that you're hearing. So, and that's all on a continuum, so we can control very finely, we can control how that is recombined. Now, it is a little important to understand the science of what's happening here. It's important to know that vibrato is changing the pitch, and it's attached to an LFO, and it moves it back and forth, right? More important, though, is to know how you use it. One of the questions is, where would I put this in my signal path? Generally near the end or in the second half of your signal path. Although there are no hard and fast rules on this, you can put your chorus pedal first if you want to. Where people will generally put it, they'll sort of get their tone right. Like they'll get the amp and the EQ and the wah or whatever they're going to do, they'll get that right. And then they'll put chorus or tremolo or rotary speaker, and then they'll do their time-based effects like reverb and delay. Although, again, there are no hard and fast rules on that. You can put chorus all the way at the end, you can put it all the way at the beginning, whatever. But if I'm setting up a generic pedal board, I would generally put chorus or flanger or phaser kind of after my amp, but before my reverb and delay, if that makes sense. How do you get these? Kind of two choices. You can use Stomp Box or you can use multi-effects pedals. With Stomp Boxes, if we're going to talk about phasers, there are probably 1,000 different phaser pedals out there, and they are all different. Every one of them sounds a little bit different, and it's the way that they implement that phase cancellation or the phase manipulation. Each one is going to sound a little different. But you could end up spending a lot of money on a Stomp Box that does one thing. Or if you have a multi-effects route, you will not have nearly as many choices in exactly which sound I want from my phaser, but you're not going to have to go buy the pedal. You don't have to figure out where am I going to put it in your signal chain. It's a lot easier. So Stomp Boxes can be more complicated and more expensive, but you can be way more specific about exactly which sound you want. With multi-effects, you kind of, well, if it's in the box, I have access to it. If it's not, I don't. But it is, obviously it's free if you already own the multi-effects, and it's a lot easier. Jesse, there is one phaser, it's orange. That's right. Tracy is actually going to demonstrate that in just a few minutes. He will talk about that, no doubt. But you're right. That's kind of like, if you're going to get a phaser, that is the phaser. So speaking of Tracy, my good friend Tracy is up now. I had this conversation with him just the other day when I was in the great state of Illinois. I was going to say beautiful, but Illinois, it's really not that beautiful, but it's a great place to be. A lot of cool people there, a lot of cool stuff there, just not the most scenic place in history. But anyway, that's where I was, and this is my conversation with Tracy. Enjoy this.
Basically, modulation is when you're taking one signal, your signal that you're playing, which we'll call a carrier signal, and then putting a different signal, something that's going to affect that signal. So that's what modulation is, basically taking a signal and altering it with another kind of device signal. So one of the simplest things, that was one of the first ways of doing this, was basically taking a signal and then just changing the volume of it so that it pulses in and out. And that is called a tremolo. And it sounds, if I hold a long note, you can kind of hear it. Right? You know, that used to be kind of the sound. Guitars would use that, like surf music. You'd hear that, that tremolo. And typically you can change the rate. So I can speed that rate up. That's slower. This is faster. Right? Pretty simple. So that's a very simple modulation effect. Another very similar one to that is a rotary speaker. And this got really started out with Leslie speakers, which are these big speaker cabinets, big piece of furniture, wooden box, stands about this tall. And they got started for organ players, for like Hammond organs and things like that. They would put them through these big speakers. And in this Leslie speaker cabinet, there would be two speakers, one up on top that was a horn that was spinning around, and then another one on the bottom that I believe was spinning in the opposite direction. I'm not positive of that. But the idea of this is that this rotating speaker would send the signal around, spatially around the room, and create a Doppler effect. So that's the kind of thing like when a siren goes past and it changes pitch. So it was kind of changing the volume of it and also changing the pitch of it a little bit as it would oscillate around. Here's an example of what that would sound like. Now that's subtle right there. And also Leslie's always had a button that was fast slow. So you could change that, and what it would do is the speaker would turn around either slowly or it would suddenly start spinning faster. But actually, it wouldn't suddenly start spinning faster. It would ramp up because it was a physical speaker that there was a motor, and it would go from slow to faster and faster. So what I'm doing right here, just so you all understand, I have a multi-effects processor called a Kemper Profiler, and it's an amp simulator with a bunch of different kinds of effects that you can add. So what I've done is I'm just kind of bringing up some of these effects. I don't have an actual Leslie cabinet here. Very few people do anymore. But there is a fast slow button, and if I crank it up, now you can hear that, and you can hear it's getting faster. Now I'm going to hit it down to slow, and you'll hear it slow down. And I'll speed it up, and you'll hear. And you can hear it's kind of a little out of tune, and it's like, so it's giving you this kind of interesting color and sound, but it's very primitive in the way it's producing that. It's actually a Doppler, a physical Doppler effect. Of course, this is a digital recreation of that, but that's how that works. It just takes the sound and spins it around. So that was developed, I think, in the 50s. So that's kind of old. The first thing that I showed you, the tremolo, actually was the very first modulation effect that was sometime in the 40s that they developed that, because it's quite simple to do. All right, moving right along. Let's look at phasing. Okay, so the way phasing, first of all, phasing sounds like this. And that's a sound that Jean-Luc Ponty really used a lot. That was sort of his signature sound for many years in the 70s. It was sort of a kind of a 70s, 60s and 70s sound. And the way that thing, and actually the one that he used, I asked him about this, and the main one that he used a lot of those recordings was just a little MXR box, single pedal, like I think one or two knobs, and analog, of course, circuitry back in the 70s. And the way it works is it's taking a signal and putting it out of phase with itself. And when you take a signal and you take the same signal out of phase, what it does is it phase cancels. That's how noise canceling headphones work. Right? If you're on a plane, you put those on, it's got a microphone, it hears the rumble of the plane, and then it takes that signal and inverts it so it cancels it, and then you don't hear it anymore. So it's really kind of incredible how effective that can work to cancel sound. But what they do in a phaser is they cancel it, but then they shift it. It's using something, a LFO, low frequency oscillator, that will change it in relation to the original. So it's not completely canceling it, it's canceling it while it's kind of changing the speed. So that's how we get this kind of throbbing effect. But it's also because the two signals are very close to each other, you'll get this slight sweeping sound. And of course, you can change the speed of that. And a lot of other things. The better phase shifters give you control over things, like you can kind of tune it. I'm just going to play an open string here, and I'm, manipulating my laptop with my other left hand. Make it more like that. You can make it more like less whiny, more whiny for robot space effects. Stuff like that. The depth of how far this LFO is traveling. So that's the way you can kind of manipulate till you get a sound that you want for a tune. And to make it musical, now I don't remember how I had it set, but let's say it's right there. For that's a little heavy duty for me. I would probably use a slower thing and less depth. And I use this actually. I play a Jean-Luc Ponty tune. And it changes it. Oh, it sounds a lot like a filter, which is like a wah-wah pedal is a filter. Filtering is not a modulation effect per se, but there's so much overlap between these effects. When you're filtering something, it's a tone control. So you can hear that it makes the tones kind of sound a little kind of nasal, a little bit bassy, that kind of thing. If I take it off and just have without any effect, that's what it would sound like. So that's what phasing does. All right, moving right along. It's very similar to another effect, which is called flange, flanging. And that sounds like this. And flanging gets its name from how they originally created this effect, which was they would take a tape machine with, reel-to-reel tape, and if you put your hand on the flange, is the hub of the tape, like where it, sits on the tape machine, and you just kind of slow it down, like you're trying to slow the reel down so that it doesn't move at the right speed. If you just subtly slow it down a little bit, it gets slightly out of phase with the original other tape. You have two of them, one going at the right speed and one that you're delaying very slightly. So it's actually a time delay effect. But what happens is when you do that, you're taking two signals and one is going slightly faster than the other. And what we're hearing is that difference between them creates this subtle sweeping effect. So it's very similar to phasing, but it's created slightly differently. So it has a little bit of different color. And again, you can change a lot of the, you can change the speed. And if you speed it right up, you can hear what that's doing. If I lower the feedback, you won't get as much. You can hear it's changing the pitch. It's doing a lot of different things. I can change the depth of it. The early, back in the 80s, I used to use an electro-harmonics stomp box called the Electric Mistress, I believe is what that was called, right? And where you could change, the color, the depth. It had three knobs on it, but because it was analog, it was just a very beautiful, warm sound. You can make it sound crazy and do, stuff like all kinds of crazy. It can almost sound like a wah-wah sometimes, but at any rate, that's what that effect is. I use that sometimes. There's a more subtle version. This is more typical of the way I would use this, and it sounds really good with distortion. Hendrix used it a lot with distortion. It kind of just gives a kind of I don't know, magical kind of sound. Let me try to crank up my distortion on this just for a second. So that's kind of a cool sound. If I take it off, that's just straight with the flange. That's kind of the sound of a flanger right there. It gets used on drums sometimes. You'll hear they put it on drums, and you'll hear the cymbals doing that. It's a real cool effect. Even some contemporary stuff. I was just listening to a D'Angelo record that had that on it, and it was really cool. Really used subtly, tastefully, but it just gives a kind of a magical kind of swirl to things. So that's your flanger. I haven't talked to you about vibratos yet. Wait a second. I'm going to backtrack here. Vibrato. We all know arm vibrato, wrist vibrato. Guitar players have a different concept of vibrato, and it sounds like this. Okay, it's doing kind of sounds like a really slow vibrato, but you can change the speed. I'm going to change the rate of that, or you can go real fast. Right? It's that sound. It's that vibrato sound, very similar to our tremolo sound. Let me get it dialed up here. Here. Very
Yeah, the
similar, but if
lines
you
between some of these get kind of blurry sometimes. Like, is that a vibe? Is that a vibrato? You know, is it a tremolo? But they're
Yep.
similar but different. But it's okay if you're not exactly sure. Gosh, is that a phaser or a flanger? It's okay.
Yeah, and the bottom line with all this is that it doesn't matter what it's called. If it sounds good, it is good. And use your ear and just. But I think the point of our little discussion here is just to make you aware of the fact that there are a variety of different colors, and it's like developing a good palate on your tongue. Like you can taste the difference between subtle spices or between different wines or things like that, different cheeses. You kind of develop. The more you taste them, the more you listen to them, the better you're going to be able to distinguish. Oh, on this track or this song, I want to hear more of a vibe thing, or I want to hear more of a tremolo thing. So again, here's the difference between a tremolo is just the volume going up and down, right? It's like you're taking a volume knob and quickly turning it up and down, and that's a tremolo. And a vibrato is when you're changing the pitch up and down. You hear that? It's different. It's different. So, but then you can combine some of these things. Before we do the combine thing, which is kind of what the Uni-Vibe does and some of these other things, I want to show you what a chorus sounds like, because that's a really popular sound that was popularized in the 80s a lot, like Andy Summers from the Police used it a lot. And that's chorusing is we're taking a signal and having another version of it that's a little bit out of time with the original, and it creates a slightly different pitch, and it's pitch shifted as well. So you can hear a little bit of a rolling sound, and that's where the pitches are combining and recombining. And if you add a delay to that, an echo, that kind of sound, that open sound. And one of the things that chorusing does, and I use chorusing a lot actually, because it spreads the signal, and you can determine on some choruses how wide you want that signal. But if you take a single signal, just a plain, I'm not doing anything to it. That's just a dry. Well, it's got some reverb, but it's just a dry signal. And then I add the chorus. It kind of makes it three-dimensional. Is the way I think of that. It's almost like it gets 3D. You get this depth to it, and that's because it's splitting it stereo. It's taking it and it's combining it with a slightly delayed version. The amount of delay on a chorus is a little wider. It's a little longer delay than it is on a flange or a phaser. Phaser, I think, is something like 15 milliseconds. A flange is about 20. And I think chorusing is about 30 to 40 or something like that. So there are different amounts of offset of the signal, which ends up, and then you modulate the one signal with the other. That's how that stuff is created. Now, I wanted to show you, I've got a few analog pedals down here. I mean, they are analog, they're stomp boxes. And I'm going to show you what those look like here real quick. I'm going to turn this off so it doesn't pop. But these are different. These are different. Sorry, I know I disappeared there for a second. These are different choruses. I happen to have a couple of. I'm using mostly my multi-effects digital box now that I've been showing you all this stuff. But I have a few old pedals from the old days. So I happen to dig up a couple of old chorus pedals that I really like the sound of. And I'm going to show you what those sound like because they all sound a little bit different. That's the small clone. It's electro harmonics. I've had this thing since the 80s, I think. So there's the dry signal. Now I'm going to add the small clone. It's a real beautiful musical pedal. It only has like really one switch, wide and narrow. That's the depth, and you can get a little crazy. I never use it like that. I'll use it like this. Just real pretty kind of sound. Gives it that three-dimensional kind of sound. All right, here's another one I got. I'll show you this one. It's called a liquid chorus. This is a real pretty one that I picked up in a shop. It's by Visual Sound. And here's what this one sounds like. Just a little different character. Just thought I'd show you since I got them. Now, here's what I want to show you, though. So this contraption, this is called a Uni-Vibe. And it comes with a pedal that controls the speed of it with a stereo cable you connect it with. And this is a combination of a vibrato and it's kind of like a phaser. It's kind of its own unique circuitry, kind of combination between the vibrato, a phaser, and a little bit of trem almost. But you can also set it to instead of being a vibrato to a chorus and a phaser. So, but it's again an analog old box that Hendrix used to use. Actually, the very same thing that I've got here.
Yeah, I thought if I bought that pedal, I would sound just like him.
That's what they told me at the store. They promised me that. The pedal controls the rate, the speed of it. So kind of like it's kind of similar, and I think it was developed to be a smaller version of a Leslie cabinet, which were used quite a bit back then. That was the one with the rotating speaker. So you can, with this pedal, you can make it go from slow to faster. And it has a really warm kind of got that kind of sound. Now I can switch it to the chorusing version. Actually, I think that's the vibrato version. This is the chorus. So real pretty kind of sound. It's a combination of that. I have a version of this on my Kemper. Pretty close approximation. Of course, you can change the speed of that. So there are all the sounds, but that's kind of a little overview of these modulation effects. Most of them, sound best when they're used subtly. They're not going to jump out and grab you. Maybe the phaser, like the way Ponte used, was pretty in your face. Pretty recognizable. You couldn't miss that there was an effect going on there. And sometimes, you'll hear a real strong effect when you want them. Just crank it up. But a lot of the times I'll use just a touch of chorus in my clean sound just to open it up, or a little bit of flange to give it a little bit of edgy kind of sweep. especially like flanging is really nice if you, it gives this, let me call it up here again. It gives this sort of sweeping, right? And it can be nice sometimes if you're doing something where you're holding something still and you don't want it to be boring. You want to give it a little life. You know, if there's just a, like a drone kind of thing, if you're holding one note for a long time, it can be boring if it's just nothing on it. So you can give it a little life by adding this sort of subtle sweep. And it just brings a little bit of musical interest to something that might be static. So that's kind of a good way to think of using some of these effects.
Yeah, we talk about additive effects versus transformative effects. And you can use these as very transformative, but I think the way most people use them, it's like you were talking about the food analogy before. These are kind of like the spices that go in. These are not the vegetables and the meat. These are generally kind of the seasonings that go on there that make the difference between like something that's kind of boring and something that's pretty good.
Yeah. Yep. And, you know, if you're mixing something, you know, you're not going to use this typically on any of these effects on your whole mix. You're going to, maybe the guitar will have a little bit of chorus on it. You know, maybe you're going to put a subtle flange on the drums or something like that. It also can help separate instruments from each other so that you kind of hear this as a distinct sound rather than it sort of washing in with the whole mix. So there's lots of ways of using these things in very musical ways to help bring your sound out. And I would recommend when you're listening to tracks, listening to recordings, especially stuff back from like the 70s where a lot of these effects were new and got used a lot, go and listen and see if you can identify what you're hearing. Is that a flange? Is it a phase? Is it a vibrato? Is it a tremolo? And you'll start, the more you start listening for them, the more you'll hear them, because they really are all over the place in a lot of late 60s and 70s recordings, especially, and then chorusing in the 80s got used a lot as well. So
yeah,
there
you
you
do
go.
a lot of live looping, and it sort of feels like that would be a good way, and I'm sure you do this, to separate, like I'm laying down one loop and then the next loop. I don't want it to sound like super different, but I just wanted to give it a little bit of separation between that last one.
Exactly. It's a really good point. When you're looping, especially like if you're stacking a bunch of sounds on top of each other, you know, layers on a loop, the more layers you have, the harder it is to distinguish between them, especially if you're using the same instrument to do all your layers. So one of the important things about looping is a whole other session that I think Matt probably got, but I'll just throw my 2 cents in, is if you can make the individual layers have different sounds. So, you know, if you have one that's clean, one that's got distortion, one that's got flange, you know, things like that, that will isolate them a little bit and give them some distinct character and help you to hear three distinct things rather than one kind of mishmash of sound.
Well, also with electric violins, there are certain frequencies they can be a little problematic if there's too much, and you can get a stack up of those frequencies, you know, say around 4K or so. If you're adding more and more violin, boy, that 4K starts stacking up on you, and using these effects can help you avoid that some.
Yes. And one thing you also have to be aware of when you're using like a flange or a phaser is that there will sometimes be a big bump in the EQ of it, in the tone. Like a phaser, you might have a lot of that sort of nasally sound around 600 or 700 hertz. And you might go like, wow, why does, you know, suddenly in order to make that work in a mix, you might have to actually EQ against that to bring some of that out, or you might want to use that to make it stand out in those frequencies. But a lot of these modulation effects will really bump certain frequencies, and they may confuse you a little bit, because like a flange that's sweeping up and down at one point is really bassy for a while, especially if you have it on a slow speed. It might be like bassy for 4 or 5 seconds, and then it gets really thin, and then it gets real trebly for 4 or 5 seconds. And you're going like, what's going on? I can't EQ this. So, you just got to expect that that's the nature of the flange. And if it's doing too much of that, turn the amount of the effect down, or the depth of the flange, so it's not sweeping from a really low frequency to a really high one, but it's maybe going from a mid to a little higher mid, a lower mid. So you can control those things usually within those effects. And that's why you might want to control them, because they can mess with your EQ of the whole mix or whatever.
I was going to say, during your playing, you're doing a lot of kind of this percussive bowing stuff. If a fellow wanted to learn about that, how would somebody find out how to play like that?
Gosh, there's almost nowhere that you can find good instruction for how to play rhythmically. But luckily, I've started a website called the Strum Bowing Groove Academy. And that's where you can find instruction about how to play rhythm with your bow. I call it strum bowing because I ripped it off from guitar players. Just like all these effect pedals that were all designed pretty much for guitar players. So there you go. StrumBowingGrooveAcademy.com. Thank you, Matt.
Awesome, man. Thank you for joining us and sharing all your wisdom and the history of all this stuff. I'm sure it's going to help people to just add a little bit, little something extra to their electric playing that is going to help separate it from just kind of the normal boring thing that you hear a lot.
Yeah, and if you were wondering where you can find some of these effects pedals and find good advice on how to use them, the electricviolinshop.com is your go-to.
My man Tracy always dropping in them commercials for us. Yeah, thank you, man. So I guess if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those for a few minutes. And I kind of feel like Tracy did a good job of covering that. I will demonstrate, just because I'm here, I will demonstrate a couple different kinds of flangers for you guys real quick, just so you can hear, like, there are a bunch of different kinds of these. All of these are in the Helix that's sitting right here, so I'll play one real quick.
Yeah, it's not working now. I have to use my own personal voice or attach the document preparation center.
My amp went to sleep on me. I'm using the new EV Everse. There we go. So that's one flanger. Let's hear another one. Here is a third kind of flanger. And let's see if there's another one. Indeed. So they obviously sound a little different with double stops than single notes. But yeah, so each one of these flangers is going to sound a little different, and that's why sometimes a stomp box is going to be the way to go if you want to be very specific about which type of modulation effect you want, or if you get a Helix that has a lot of choices in it. Most of the less expensive Like the ME90, I think has one flanger in it. It's got maybe one or two phasers in it. The Helix has lots, but that's why they cost more. Not seeing a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to call it a day. Next week, I'm trying to think. I don't think we're doing a live stream next week because we've got somebody coming in as a customer that we're going to be spending a little time with. But in the next few weeks, we'll be doing a few more of these, and then we're going to kind of wrap up this Effects on Violin series, and then we'll move on to some other things. So thank you guys for hanging out, and I will see you next time.